and welcome to Your Story Stinks, the podcast where I talk about terrible stories. Today we're going to be talking about Handbook for Mortals. Now, I'm a little late to the party on this one because I don't normally read new adult / young adult books. I just don't. I'm just not interested in them. The reality is that most of them are bad for reasons that can be copy-pasted 100 times. Anytime you get a genre like young adult or new adult where it's super oversaturated, the bad books tend to be bad in familiar ways, and that just isn't interesting for me to talk about. I've said before that I don't want to talk about a story unless it's bad in some interesting way, and Handbook for Mortals is certainly interesting. I mean, it's infuriating. The author is deluded and possibly a psychopath. There's a whole bunch of, scummy behavior behind the scenes involving this, but quite honestly, it's still interesting and still worth talking about. In fact, one would say it's infamously bad. So much so that people were like, oh, is this the author of My Immortal? Which, can I just take an aside and say that for all the legendary badness of My Immortal, I never found My Immortal to be particularly bad compared to some things. Maybe I've just been exposed to too many horrifically bad things, but My Immortal is bad in all the most boring ways, at least in my opinion. The writing is terrible, everything is juvenile, it's clearly written by, a preteen or a teenager who's going through some shit. It's not bad in any interesting way, in my opinion. It's just sort of the sort of bad that's become routine if you just randomly browse fanfiction.net. Anyway, so Handbook for Mortals. So first things first, we gotta talk about all the stuff behind it. So this book ended up on the New York Times bestseller list for one day because the author pulled a stunt where they only ordered the books from specific bookstores that they knew in advance reported to the New York Times. So essentially the author with her publishing company bought a bunch of books specifically to make it look like there was huge demand for her book to get it on the New York Times bestseller list. Now, this caused it to unseat The Hate U Give, which is, at least at this point, considered a modern classic. I've never read it, it's not my kind of book, but I'm going to take the word of all of the other people who lavish it with praise that it's very good. However, as you can imagine, this caused a huge uproar, and the author immediately went into attack mode and said everything from, oh, this is, the plight of, people looking down on white women to, oh, I'm so attacked, and then she started, selling courses on how you too can get on the New York Times bestseller list and how she's a victim, and et cetera, et cetera. The author basically speed ran the right-wing grifter, I don't want to say career path, but it's basically that. It's do a thing that is bad, that everyone says is bad. When everyone critiques you, immediately make it about the fact that you're white, and then say that you're a victim, and then cash in on the fact that everybody is clearly mad at you for this thing and say that you're being canceled. This is a tried and true strategy at this point for anybody who's trying to profit off of outrage. However, the reality is, and the thing that struck me about this, is that this is not out of place for political books. And for those of you who don't know this, because I don't know how many people actually are aware of this, but every politician you can probably name has written a New York Times bestseller list book. Usually it's some kind of biography or autobiography. And the reason for this is because what they do is they write a book, and then their political campaign / their political party buys thousands and thousands of copies of this book. If you want to know how guys like Ben Shapiro end up on the New York Times bestseller list, how guys like Bill O'Reilly end up there, despite the fact that they are not authors, they do so because political campaigns and the like buy their books. And obviously those are news guys, but, you know, guys like Mitt Romney can claim that they're New York Times bestsellers because they wrote a book and then their political campaign bought their book in bulk and distributed it to like every campaign across the country. It's just how the thing functions. It got so bad that now there's a in bulk section on the New York Times bestseller list for this very behavior. So the author of Handbook for Mortals is not doing anything that to me seemed strange or new or innovative. People were treating this like she hacked the system or she clearly tried to game the system at the very least. And she did, but she was doing it in a way that has been tried and true many times before. I think the only thing that was strange about it was that she acted like she wasn't going to get caught, which is funny because, like, again, this is not a new thing. Other people have done this for decades at this point, and it's a known way to do this. Like, I don't know. Maybe she was so arrogant she thought no one would catch her. Maybe her publishing house thought that this was a great way to drum up business. Whatever it was, the author is delusional, to say the least. Handbook for Mortals is a self-insert book where the author reimagines her 20s, essentially, but she imagines her 20s as being like a magical girl story, but the magical girl part of it is only like, it's garnish, basically. It doesn't actually have any relevance to the plot. In fact, most things in this book have no relevance to the plot. If you stripped away all the nonsense, the plot line is a very straightforward romance involving a self-insert character and two other characters, where she is the moral and ethical center of the universe. In other words, it's basic self-insert bullshit. There's nothing particularly interesting about that. If you just sat down and somebody told you, hey, your job now is to write self-insert Mary Sue fiction, and you have to write like the stereotypical version and get as close as you can to what is considered the stereotype of Mary Sue self-insert, you would probably write Handbook for Mortals. It has all the main things. Every girl who is not the main character is a bitch. Every character who is a guy lusts after her. She meets real-life famous figures involving people like Wayne Newton and Carrot Top, and I will get into that. And they obviously lavish praise on her. She gets everything she wants without any effort. People are constantly saying how special and important she is, and there are never any consequences for her actions. You know, very cut and dry. You could have trained an AI to write this book, essentially. The only reason... No, that's not true. An AI couldn't write this book because an AI would actually have written it correctly. Like, she's an inept writer, and she's inept in the same way that, like, E.L. James is inept, in the sense of they're constantly trying to pad the runtime because they don't have a story, and so they're just repeating things over and over again. Nothing is shown to you, everything is told to you, so everything ends up being super wordy. The main character spends way too much time focusing on herself and her own ideas because, again, it's a self-insert, but all of her thoughts are about herself too, so she spends pages and pages and pages just thinking about how great she is. And of course, you know, she's quote-unquote not like other girls, so that means that it's every kind of toxic femininity, if I can pronounce that word correctly, where if the main character does things, it's good, but if other women are interested in having sex or going shopping or demonstrating any kind of normal, traditional feminine behavior, it's a negative. So, obviously, double standard, obviously dealing with character-centered morality, etc., etc. So, what makes this interesting? Why is this book being talked about by me? Why do I bring all of this up, and why am I talking about a story that sounds so mundane when you boil it down? Because, make no mistake, this could have been published on any website, like any website, and it probably wouldn't have looked out of place if you had put this on fanfiction.net or AO3 or whatever, and it wouldn't have seemed strange. It would have just been like, oh, this is really bad, and everybody would have shrugged and moved on. It's only noteworthy to a lot of people because it was published by a delusional author. A delusional author who, by the way, wrote this originally as a screenplay and then adopted the screenplay into a book, which she published, but then adopted the screenplay from the book from the screenplay. And it's obvious what parts got moved around and what parts got, reshuffled and what parts were copied verbatim, because there are scenes where you're like, okay, yeah, this was clearly in the screenplay because it's so focused on what actors would be caring about, but that doesn't translate to a book. I talked about this when I talked about Fantastic Beasts, where it's like J.K. Rowling wrote books, but she's not a screenwriter, because screenwriting and novel writing are different, and they have different needs. Now, obviously, when you're dealing with a author who is writing a book and a screenplay where she wants to play the main character, and it's all about her imaginary life that's better than her real life, and she's pushing 50, I think, and she's writing herself as a 20-year-old, there are a lot of problems that seem avoidable. In a lot of ways, talking about the problems is a bit like talking about somebody who keeps stepping on rakes that they themselves put down. It's a bit Looney Tunes. But I want to point out some ways in which the author seems to have... I don't want to say she Neil-Breened herself, but I'm going to get into that. Essentially, this book reminds me of what Red Letter Media calls the black tank top movie. So for those of you who don't know, for some reason, 50 to 60-year-old, real estate agents, lawyers, that kind of thing, guys like Neil Breen always want to be an action star. And so, because they have money, they write, direct, and star in a movie where they're an action star and they get the girl and everybody likes them. And at some point in these movies, they're always wearing a black tank top for some reason. It's just a weird thing that they all seem to want to do. And in those movies, it's bizarre. So in a Neil Breen movie, you have a guy who's a real estate agent who's playing a super hacker, and he hacks the government, and he gets all the women, and he's invincible, and sometimes he plays Jesus. But the point is that is what this author is doing. This is the female version of that. This is the female version of The Room. This is the female version of a Neil Breen movie. This is essentially a woman's fantasy that is structured and written exactly like you would write a Neil Breen movie. Or you would write The Room, where your protagonist is the most important person on the planet. Although, I will say this. The Room gets a bad rap for a good reason, but it's interesting to me that Tommy Wiseau wrote the main character as the most unhappy, miserable person. He clearly wrote a tragedy, or he wants it to be a tragedy, and it's horrible and self-indulgent, which almost makes it more forgivable that it's so bad, because he didn't write himself as an action movie star. He wrote himself as a martyr, which is much more amusing, I would say. But anyway, so the protagonist / author has written the fantasy version of what she wants, or what she wanted her 20s to be. But she is, I think, late 40s, early 50s, but she writes the book taking place in modern day. And that's very noticeable in ways that I don't know that the author, like, was aware of. So to give you some idea of this, the author is constantly name dropping people she admires and she knows. So Carrot Top, Wayne Newton, Plain White Tees, all of these bands, or all of these figures, I should say, are or were at their height when she was the age that her protagonist was in like the mid 90s. Like, if you want to think about, okay, when was Carrot Top at his cultural height? It was like 1995 or something. It was somewhere in that range. And she writes it as though these figures are just as big today. And she writes everything from the perspective of someone who doesn't have any clue about modern day sensibilities, because she doesn't. But this could have been easily avoided if she just wrote this as taking place in like 1995. Like, if she had wrote her 20-year-old character or whatever as being a character who was living at the time they're supposed to be, like, this would have been fine. But she writes her self-insert being like 22 or whatever in modern day, in like 2020, which is really weird and confusing, and it doesn't make a lot of sense. The other thing about this is that obviously it has the hallmark of people she clearly knew in life showing up. By which I mean, like, there are conversations that happen, and you can tell that the author has been stewing about these conversations, and she's like, yeah, look at me as I get one over on them. So, just for example, there's a scene in this book where the protagonist is dealing with this character named Sophia. And Sophia is the token bitch character, where she is, like, materialistic. She's slept her way to the top. She's, constantly undermining everyone else. She's constantly doing things that are dangerous and stupid. Typical mean girls bullshit. But there's a scene where the main character and her have a conversation. And the conversation is like, you hate me. And Sophia's like, I never said I hated you. And the protagonist is like, you clearly meant it. And then, like, Sophia has this almost monologue where she's like, I don't hate you. I hate the fact that you haven't paid your dues. And you didn't pay your dues, at least not here, because it doesn't count where you're from. You may have paid your dues there, but you didn't pay your dues here. And also, I don't like the fact that you show up and everybody's, like, lavishing praise on you. And it's this really weird scene, because if you're the reader, you're looking at this and going, man, she's making a lot of sense. She's, like, clearly in the right here, and she's demolishing our protagonist. But the protagonist continues on as though this wasn't, like, a crushing, like, fatal blow to the character. And this happens several times. And again, I want to point out that this scene on its own is not strange for a self-insert story. There's always going to be those scenes where the writer is like, oh, I'm going to show them by showing how stupid they were in this conversation. And usually it's done in such a way that the other person is essentially a straw man, where the main character can demolish them with facts and logic. Usually this is written the same way you would write, like, those conservative guys who are like, debate me, coward, and then immediately shirk away as soon as you try to do that, because they're not so much interested in debating, they're just interested in, like, dumping all over you and feeling superior. And so usually that's what you would expect. That's what you would have expected the writer to have written for her self-insert. But that isn't what she does. She writes this in such a way that every time this happens, it feels like she's unaware that she's demolishing herself. Like, I've never seen a self-insert Mary Sue where every main character, every other character who has a problem with her, will bring up points about how terrible she is, and the main character walks away as though she won. You know? It's like, I'm so humble by turning the other cheek. I'm so humble by doing this and not, like, making a scene about it. But all that really comes across is other characters are constantly saying how terrible our protagonist is, and the protagonist seems to be completely unaware of this. It's actually kind of funny. Now, it's entirely, like, accidental. She did not mean to do that. When she wrote this, clearly, like, meant for her character to be in the right, but she's incapable of articulating why she's in the right to these conversations that are clearly written based on conversations she's actually had. Because again, the author is somebody who has worked in showbiz. The author is somebody who has, no respect for anyone else's, like, industry. The author is somebody who clearly resents anybody acting like they know better, even if they do. There's a pretty infamous scene regarding this where, like, the protagonist is at the mall for, like, the fourth time, despite the fact that every time she goes to the mall, she says that she's not like other girls who go to the mall. And she does this so many times that it almost feels like the intro series of jokes in Freddy Got Fingered, where they just repeat the word proud over and over again, where he's like, I'm gonna make you proud, daddy. You're gonna make me proud. And they just keep repeating that word as a joke, but they don't explain the joke. Like, it feels like that in this book, where she goes to the mall over and over again, and every time she does, she has to tell the audience that she's not like other girls, and she just had to go there and had to spend all this money and had to buy clothes and all this other stuff, and why she's not, materialistic like all those other girls who were doing the exact same thing. But anyway, she has a conversation with a barista at this place where she's getting lemonade, and she's, like, super angry. So the scene plays out like this. She goes to get lemonade. The guy behind the counter looks at her and is into her. The other person who's behind the counter looks at her, looks at the guy, and then steps in all angry because apparently the two people behind the counter are dating. So the girl behind the counter is super mad that our self-insert protagonist has somehow, like, dragged him closer or something, like ensnared him in some kind of love spell or whatever. It's unclear. She acts like she's the Purple Man from Marvel, where she just walks around and everybody loves her, essentially. But they have this argument, and the argument is structured in such a way that it's clear that the protagonist / author is having an argument that she clearly had with someone at some point. And this all ends with her having no, like, rebuttal to this worker. And so what she does is she uses her magic, one of the few times she uses her magic, by the way, to cause the blender to explode and cause the minimum wage worker behind the counter, who was mad that our protagonist is trying to steal her boyfriend, causes her to be riddled with broken glass and have to go to the hospital. This happens several times, by the way, where our protagonist uses her magic, but only in petty, vindictive ways, where she acts like she's karma for everybody else, and it's clearly the author who is, like, working out all of her grudges on other people. So, like, for no reason, there's a scene where a guy on a bike whizzes past her, and she's like, man, I hated that, and I was so angry, and so I caused him to have a traffic accident where he was almost paralyzed. And the scene is written so it says something like, oh, I was pretty sure he wasn't permanently injured. And it's like, she's acting as the agent of karma, which really could have been an interesting twist if we weren't supposed to be, like, empathizing with the fact that she's causing horrific injuries to other people for minor, like, problems. But again, it's clearly the author working these out, and they're always structured in such a way where this is clearly something that happened to her. She clearly had some kind of argument with somebody behind the counter. Maybe she just hates Starbucks baristas or something, and she's like, I hate them, so I'm going to have a scene where I take them down a peg. And there's another scene where, like, with the bike guy, where she's like, I hate people on bikes, so I'm going to take them down a peg. And this keeps happening, where the only time she ever uses her magic powers, despite being a magical girl, and despite being, of course, having so much power that she doesn't know anything about, all that other bullshit that never comes into the story. Despite all that, she only uses her powers for, like, transparently evil things. Which, again, could have been interesting. I mean, it's very curious to me that at every opportunity, she writes conversations where she's supposed to be in the right, but she doesn't know how to argue at all, so she's never portrayed as being in the right. She just acts like she is. So another scene that happens is she's up in the catwalk area talking to the tech guy for the show, and they're having an argument where he's like, I need to know what you're doing because I'm the tech guy. It's my job to, like, help structure everything. And he's talking to her about, like, OSHA safety regulations and stuff, and she's like, oh, I don't need to tell you anything because I know what I'm doing, and magic has to be, like, hidden and all this other stuff. And he's like, yeah, this would not, like, this can't fly. I've been doing this job forever, and sorry, princess, but you're not going to get your way. You're not special, etc., etc. Like, again, this is clearly a discussion that she's had with a tech guy where she felt that she didn't need to follow the rules, or that the rules were stupid, or that she knew the rules better. Anyone who knows anything in this book is portrayed as not being as smart as our protagonist because the author wishes to vent her spleen at every opportunity. And I can't argue this enough. It's only interesting because the author is so inept that she writes herself as the loser of every conversation she has, but she acts like she's the winner, so it's this weird disconnect. Like, again, it would just be regular boring if the author wrote a character where the character was always right and everybody was like, oh, you're so great and you're totally correct. We don't have to violate any of these things, or we don't have to follow any of these things, and we don't have to, do anything that we normally do because you're so special. Like, that's how it should normally be written if you're writing terrible self-insert Mary Sue fiction. But that's not how she writes it. She's so convinced that she's logically correct, not just morally correct, that she presents the arguments against her with perfect clarity and presents her own arguments completely ineptly. And so she's always in the wrong. So the reader is constantly like, yeah, that totally makes sense. Why is our main character supposed to be liked again? There's so many cases of this where, like, it's clear that the author is, like, delusional on a level you rarely see. Because, of course, she wrote this screenplay, and then she wrote a book about the screenplay, and then she wrote a screenplay based on the book, based on the screenplay, and, of course, she was going to play the main woman in this, in this screenplay, and, the main character looks exactly like her, and, like, isn't like other girls, and has multicolored hair, all the trademarks, essentially. And again, it wouldn't be interesting if not for the fact that it's so inept. Like, it's so bumbling. It's so, like, counterintuitive. Like, to compare this with, like, a Neil Breen movie. In every Neil Breen movie, he's like, the government is hiding things, and the banks are hiding things, and all these other things, and I'm the only one who can do this. And everybody's like, no, you can't do this. You're wrong, you're crazy, etc., etc. And then Neil Breen is like, no, I'm totally correct. And then he hacks the government and proves he's correct. Like, in your normal self-insert, like, wish fulfillment, you would think that you would write the protagonist as always being logically, morally correct. You would write the protagonist to be like, yes, whatever you're saying is true, but here's my logic, and my logic is better. But that isn't what happens. She presents their logic, which is sound because it's clearly something that's been told to her, and then she presents her own logic, which is not sound and doesn't make any sense, and then she goes, I won, and walks away, and that's the end of the scene, which is a bit like, getting into a forum argument and then just, like, piecing out halfway through and declaring victory, despite the fact that you've done nothing to argue your point at all. And this, again, wouldn't be interesting if it didn't keep happening, because the rest of the book is, again, paint by numbers, self-insert, Mary Sue, wish fulfillment. It's, oh, I'm a magical girl, and I'm so special, and oh, I got a show on Broadway, and oh, Carrot Top thinks I'm cool, and I'm gonna go see the play White Tees who think I'm great and want to play for my show, and oh, all the boys love me, so I'm in a love triangle, and it's all very paint by numbers, boring, could have been written by an AI. It's just interesting to me because it's so confusing. Like, why would you write your self-insert wish fulfillment story where your protagonist is constantly being discredited at every opportunity? Like, it's so weird. It's so weird. And I mean, I could get into things like the racism and the racial slurs and all that stuff, because of course our author slash main character is a new age, like, weirdo whose, like, exposure to the, like, Romuva or Romani religion slash ethnicity is entirely through Hollywood. So there's constant scenes of tarot cards and stuff like that, and the author clearly doesn't know anything about them. The author clearly is just drawing on all of these things that she has done no research about. Again, like E.L. James. But E.L. James is at least doing what she wants. As I said when I talked about The Mister, E.L. James knows exactly what she wants to write. And so, to everybody else, it's boring and downright, like, creepy, but it's her fantasy. She's just writing it over and over again. This is not that. This is, like, the author isn't really certain about anything. Like, the author clearly wants to draw all these things that she thinks is cool, which, again, fits into, like, the 1990s, like, new age spirituality movement, where all of these white women who are like, oh yeah, man, I'm totally, like, all, the crystals and, the bullshit tarot card readings and the past lives and all this other bullcrap that showed up in every single, like, weird store. We're not talking, like, actual Wiccans, we're talking, like, clearly made to sell products to people who don't think, like, modern stuff is legit. If the author came out and said that she was, like, against vaccines and used essential oils, that would be on brand for the kind of spirituality that's in this book. And okay, so there is one other thing I need to talk about, and it's the bizarre POV skewing on a constant basis. I mean, yeah, ignore the fact that this is a book where the main character knows a thing, but it's kept secret from the audience despite the fact that we're in the main character's head for most of it. Again, doesn't make sense, and you can't really do that, but let's put that aside for a second, because in my opinion, the more egregious thing is that the POV shifts constantly between multiple characters in the same scene. So you'll get, like, a page and a half of our protagonist, and then it will shift over to her love interest at the time, who will get, like, a paragraph. But she hasn't written that paragraph to the point where she, as the writer, is outside of her own main character's head, so she will occasionally write from a different person's perspective as her protagonist. Like, she'll slip into I and we talking about her female self-insert from the perspective of somebody who is not her female self-insert, and it's very confusing. She switches tenses constantly, and there's an entire, 3 chapters that take place where she's in a coma, and she's like a disembodied spirit who is seeing the world from other people's perspectives, like she's watching their memories, but she's also having her own thoughts, and the thoughts, as they're described, blend together horrifically. It's amazing, honestly. I should also point out that she tries to square the circle of her not being, the same age as the protagonist by writing the love story of her parents. So there's an entire chapter dedicated to the protagonist's father and mother getting together and their, romance and everything. And let me just say, kind of weird that our protagonist is like, yeah, I want to know how my parents got together and I want to see their romance of them banging. And I just want to point out that the protagonist is both the 20-year-old character and her mother, but only the mother when she's doing things that relate to the author. So, in the beginning, the mother is described as an overbearing, terrible mother who wouldn't let her daughter see her father and kept her in this small town in the middle of nowhere that she hated. Normal Dursley's stuff. But then, towards the second, or 2/3 of the way through the book, she is suddenly redeemed because now the author is writing as though this romance is her own, and I would not be surprised if the author has been divorced, because this reeks of, I'm going to write what my marriage was like in the 90s, because that's when I think this takes place, where she's writing from the perspective of, oh, I'm gonna get with this guy, and the mother, the author is both the mother and the daughter. They're both self-inserts. They're the same self-insert character, is what I'm trying to get at, which is wild. We're talking Fry being his own grandpa, but imagine if Fry was his own grandpa, but they were both individuals who existed in the same space. They were two separate people who existed in the same place, but they were both the same person. That is what's going on here. It's kind of wild. It's confusing as hell, but it's wild. I've never seen this before. Normally, when you write Mary Sue self-insert, you write one character, and that character is the center of the universe. You don't suddenly cut for 3 chapters 2/3 of the way into the book to a different character who is now also the self-insert. Imagine for a perspective, just to give, it's so hard to talk about this because it's so confusing. You need a spreadsheet to explain how this actually works, because the line between author and character blurs constantly, and the difference between something that's clearly fiction and something that's clearly an experience she had is also blurred constantly. It's a bit like if Neil Breen or Tommy Wiseau played their protagonists, but they also played their own kid or their own father, and they were both self-inserts at the same time, and it's what? I don't know. It's just, I see the seeds of a book she probably should have written, which is the mother's perspective, which takes place 20-something years earlier. That probably would have been, I don't think it would have been better. It wouldn't have been good, but it would have been more understandable if she wrote the perspective of, this was when I was 20, and these characters are 20, and this is 20 years ago. Not, I am a 50-year-old writing from the perspective of a 20-year-old, but I'm writing her as a 50-year-old. And also I'm writing her mother, who is also 50. It's confusing, and it's wild. Like, this is a book where it almost deserves to be studied. Like, this book should be assigned to, like, literature students or writing students to know all the things you shouldn't do. Like, rather than reading, like, Edgar Allan Poe and going, look at what he's doing here. No, read this book and be like, this is what you shouldn't do. And if you find yourself relating to anything when you're writing, like if you find yourself writing and going, wow, this reminds me of a handbook for mortals, you know, you should stop and take a step back and realize that what you're doing is crap. Like, in terms of self-insert Mary Sue fiction, it's sort of mundane and uninteresting. There's not a lot of plot. It's a very straightforward love triangle that isn't a love triangle. It's more like she's got one guy and he gets 95% of the screen time, and then there's a guy who has 5% of the screen time that she's clearly never going to get with. But he's there for drama reasons. But aside from that, there's not a whole lot of plot. The magic only comes into play whenever she wants to be vindictive and act as the karma of the universe. And, well, okay, the karma of the universe and the scene where it looks like she's being sacrificed, which would have been hilarious, but no, the way to cure her is to stab her through the heart, which is hilarious. Also, she uses Croatian as though it was a magical language, which, again, hilarious. Okay? You can take her quote-unquote magical words and you can put them into Google Translate, and Google Translate's like, this is Croatian, which means that in order to come up with magical sounding words, she just used Google Translate to use Croatian, which, again, hilarious. You might as well have just used Babelfish or something. Like, absolutely top-tier laziness, but also top-tier, like, hubris to assume that nobody would try to, like, Google search that. At the very least, you know, J.K. Rowling used Latin and made up bullshit Latin-sounding words, okay? She at least made bullshit up, you know? This author doesn't even do that. This author just uses Google Translate. It's like, yeah, Croatia is filled with magical, like, words and shit, I guess. And I just want to say this for a moment. What is it with new adult authors acting like Eastern Europe is a magical place? This is the second book where this has come into play, where, again, E.L. James is like Albania, actually looks like medieval Romania, and it's all magical and bullshit, and they have Netflix but don't have credit cards. And then this one is, yeah, actually Croatian is a magical language. Like, it's kind of amazing. It's really baffling. I just don't get it. I don't know, man. I don't know if this is a case where, like, she's so inept that she doesn't know what she's doing, or if this is a case where she's, like, trying to be bad. I assume she's not trying to be bad because she wants to play the lead. So she has to be, like, inept, but it's written in such a way where, like, she's undermining herself and doesn't realize it. So rather than write herself as the moral center of the universe, she writes herself as the moral black hole of the universe. Like, she writes herself as a character where every time another character gets to speak about her, they're overwhelmingly negative most of the time. And they all sound like she's the worst human being, and she just takes all their negativity and goes, this means I'm right. No. It doesn't. I don't know, man. She apparently thinks this is going to be a series. It's been like 4 years now, and she hasn't written the second one. Honestly, like, there's so much more with this, man. If I really want to get into nitty-gritty, you could break it down chapter by chapter on how wrong it is and how little she understands about the shit she's talking about. I mean, it's not uncommon for weird new adult, young adult stuff to be, you know, just completely steeped in bullshit new age velvet, you know, mysticism. But it's so funny that she doesn't even, like, understand the basics of what she's doing, to the point where you as an audience member listening to this, and me as somebody who knows basically nothing about New Age mysticism in terms of like deep lore could just tell you that she's totally making shit up as she goes along. You know? Like, you could know basically nothing and go, I don't think those tarot cards mean what you are claiming they mean, just from the pictures on them, kind of thing. Like, I wonder if she doesn't, like, have the ability to understand images, because she painstakingly shows tarot spreads in this book, and looking at the tarot spreads, which she clearly just, like, made up because they sounded cool, are very clearly wrong. Like, her interpretation of the cards is just blatantly wrong. And you don't even need to know what the cards mean. You know, if you're drawing cards like Death and the Tower, and you're like, yeah, that looks bad. And she's like, that looks perfect. Like, very clearly, like, the cards show things that look negative. And you're just kind of like, yeah, I think the vibes are wrong here. And she's like, no, the vibes are great. Like, it's that kind of disconnect where she's clearly so overconfident and so self-absorbed that she just assumes she can say things and that makes them true. like that's what's wild about this. Like, it's just so wild to me that she, like, more than any of the stuff that she tried to, like, rig the system. Because, like I said, other people have tried and done that before. That's not particularly interesting. It's interesting to me that she has so much hubris that she felt that she could essentially be wrong to your face and just sort of YOLO it and get away with it. Like, it's so baffling. It's so baffling. Like, My Immortal is bad, but My Immortal, like, is put together. It has a central concept. It's terrible. It's written by a teenager. This is written by, like, a 50-year-old who clearly doesn't understand basic grammatical structure, but also doesn't understand any of the things she brings into her story. She brings in concepts from show business and acts like she's an authority. She brings in concepts like tarot and New Age mysticism and doesn't know anything about it. She brings in Romani people and doesn't know anything about it. She brings in, you know, again, Croatian is magic and doesn't know anything about it. It's just... If it was one thing, you could probably be like, okay, this author just didn't know this thing. But it's everything. Everything the protagonist slash author comes into, like, contact with, she doesn't understand, but thinks she does. Again, going back to just the basics of having a disagreement with the tech lead, whose job it is to keep everybody safe. Like, having an argument with him about how she doesn't have to play by the rules. Like, you don't know anything about this. It's clear you don't know anything about this because you're writing a conversation where your protagonist doesn't know anything about this and comes off looking like a moron. Like, I don't think I've ever seen a self-insert that made the protagonist look like an idiot. You know? Like, normally you want your self-insert to look like the greatest person who ever lived. But in this book, the author makes her protagonist look like a dumbass, and it's entirely accidental. Like, it's fascinating. It's fascinating to me that this is a thing that exists, and at no point did she or anyone else look at this, because apparently this had like 3 editors, according to her. Like, at no point did anybody look at this and go, yeah, your protagonist looks like a dumbass. You should make it so that she looks like she's right at any point, because she doesn't. At no point in this book does she ever look like she's in the right. She always looks like she's in the wrong, and the author just assumes that she's in the right because the author agrees with her position. But the rest of the universe doesn't reflect this. It's amazing. It's kind of amazing. It's terrible, and you probably shouldn't read it, but if you just, like, looked up a synopsis of this book, you can tell immediately how utterly insane the author has to be to think this is good, to think this was going to be a multimedia, like, sensation. The fact that she thought that she was going to make a movie out of this, and that there were going to be movie rights, and that she, a 50-year-old, was going to play her 20-something-year-old lead, like, man, oh man, just layers upon layers of delusion. At least Neil Breen doesn't do that. Tommy Wiseau didn't do that. Tommy Wiseau wrote a character who was a martyr, and at least he understood that, his character was, always supposed to be miserable. That's why he dies at the end. Like, Neil Breen, when he writes a character, at least has everybody go, yeah, he was totally right at every point. In this case, the author is just like, every character she encounters who's an enemy goes, you're totally wrong, and the audience ends up sympathizing with them because she doesn't provide a decent enough rebuttal, and at no point does anything come around to explain why the author was actually right. So it's just kind of weird. Like, this is clearly a book that was meant to, like, massage the author's ego, but it comes off looking like the author massaging her ego is akin to, like, a BDSM session in the 50 Shades universe. Like, that's what it comes off like to me, where it's just painful and unfun. I don't know. I don't know what she was thinking, man. But it's interesting. This is one of those books that needs to be, like, examined in a lab for its uniqueness, because I don't think any other author I've ever known has written a self-insert like this, has ever written, like, a Mary Sue character like this. It's distinct enough that I'm like, oh yeah, that's a thing that's only happened here, because no other self-insert Mary Sue character, no other wish fulfillment fantasy would ever write, like, the interactions like this. At no point would they do that, because they'd want their protagonist to come off like the greatest thing to ever live. But that's not how she comes off. Man, Handbook for Mortals is a trip. I don't recommend reading it, but if you want to, like, look up somebody else's, like, review of it, it's probably worth it, because it's just insane. But yeah, that's Handbook for Mortals. I should point out that there is no Handbook for Mortals in Handbook for Mortals, and there's nobody who's immortal in Handbook for Mortals. So the title's just a lie. There's a name drop at the end of the book, but the title's a lie. Because there's no other, like, magical creatures or anything in this book. But yeah, that's the book. That's Handbook for Mortals. That's the most confusing and, in my opinion, interesting unicorn-like self-insert Mary Sue fiction. I don't know what I'm going to do next, man, but I'm probably going to do something that's not young adults, because I'm tired of this genre, I think. I need to find something that's bad in a unique way that's not like this. But yeah, this story stinks, man. See y'all later.